oligarchy was in control.
Perfect.
Okay.
So, welcome all and welcome, Michael. Good to have you here again. How are you?
Good to be back.
Our pleasure as usual. Let me just introduce you shortly first. I think most people know quite a lot of you, but anyway. Okay, so I take it short. You have been advisor to governments, warned correctly about debt crisis in Latin America and the great financial crisis 2008. You worked on Wall Street as an economist. One of your assignments was to calculate how much it was possible to in-debt Latin American countries, so all their export income was used to pay interest on loans. So another way of putting it is how much can you put these countries in debt? So that was the thing. And as an associate to Harvard, you led research into 4,000 years of the history of debt, money, and the economy. Also, you have written several books. So I think that's kind of it. But even though with your extensive experience, I mean, I could talk, I guess, 30 minutes about your CV.
We did that before.
Yeah, so last time you showed us that big financiers historically has acted to write the rules for their benefit. And we call that financialization though, okay? And for that to work, finance must influence our way of thinking, mainly with regards to how we view money, debt, and value. So today is the thought that we will go into value, but before that, I think we could do a short summary of last time, and I'm gonna share the screen here first. And now, there we, please. Yeah. Okay. So last time you were here, you gave us a long-term view of money, debt, and the economy, starting from Sumer and Babylonian time to today. So, and you show that there has been thousands of years of power struggles where financial interests want to take control over society and the economy, and it goes on today. And if you look at this picture, we can simplify this by dividing history into two parts. First, from Sumer to Roman order, that's the green part in the picture. During that time, debt jubilee by issuer of credit was common. Money was a tool to develop society. Local authorities used bookkeeping to keep track on transactions and to record debt and credit. An issuer used debt jubilee to cancel debt in order to preserve self-sustainability in society. And then if we jump over to the reddish parts here, from Roman order, okay, there we have the change. And suddenly private financiers in power due to their financial wealth. Money viewed as wealth, a commodity and scarce. Debt is sacrosanct, otherwise no financier will give any loans and the economy will fail without financing. This made it possible to use private debt as an instrument to grab property from others as long as you can enforce it. And you were also into, from your Canadian experience and a few other things, that government debt in own currency is not a problem. High private debt or government debt in foreign currency is a cause for crisis. We also have had Steve Keynes here, and he showed this clearly, even though common thinking seems to be the other way around. I try to make that short. Is there anything you'd like to add on that, Michael?
No, that's basically it.
Okay.
Yeah, you mentioned that financiers write the rules for their own benefit. I think the rules are called constitution and bodies of law. And pro-financial rules are the distinguishing feature of Western civilization since classical antiquity. And that represented a sharp break from the earlier Near Eastern practice. In Greece and Rome, you didn't have kings, at least after the kings were overthrown by Rome's oligarchy early in its history. So the financial elites succeeded in blocking the tradition of Near Eastern monarchies and canceling the debts and preventing an oligarchic financial class from emerging. That really is what makes Western civilization so different from everything that went before, because without kings, without government, without who the Greeks called tyrants, the oligarchy was in control. And it managed democracy by a number of political tricks. It had a Senate that had a number of blocks, like the pro-bull in Athens. The Senate could decide what the public assembly was allowed to discuss. And Rome's constitution let everybody vote, but the rich people's votes counted for hundreds of times more than the votes of other people. It's almost like the United States today, where the donor class's contributions to US politicians way overshadows what the voters want, which is why the political rules in the United States reflect the donor class rather than democracy, just like in Rome.
Okay, so Rome was the cradle for what we see today, kind of.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So let's get over to financialization, a difficult word for Finn. Okay, so could you just tell us a bit about what it is and what is the business plan and what foundations does it stand on and how it is played out in the world today? I think you said a bit about it, but please more.
Well, financialization requires going into debt in order to get basic needs. For housing, for instance, instead of paying rent to the landlords, like you did ever since feudalism to the 19th century, now homes are bought on credit, so that the rent that used to be paid to landlords is now paid to the banks as interest. Rent is for paying interest. And over the course of a 30-year mortgage, the banks end up receiving more money in interest than the seller receives when he or she sells the property. So the idea of paying rent to get property as interest to the banks is the motto for commercial real estate investors. And this goes right throughout the economy. Instead of funding pensions or healthcare on a pay-as-you-go basis, as they do in most of Europe, by governments or employers, current income has to be set aside in advance and invested in the financial market, in stocks and bonds, or in just plain financial gambling. And the hope is to make money financially. But the way that the financial sector makes money is to really exploit labor. And so labor pays its pensions by financing the exploitation of labor. That's what Marx called an internal contradiction. The financialization process is basically anti-labor. And in as much as the policy aim of financialization is privatization, it wants the assets, it wants to be the government. The financialization wants the banks to be the government, not elected officials. So financialization and libertarian free markets aim at centralizing control in the form of the banks. So you have a much more centralized control under financialization than you do under democracy or even state-run economies. And so what they do is they use this control in order to force the state to sell off its public enterprises, its railroads, its pension plans, its healthcare, and all of this by privatizing basic social utilities, education, healthcare. You add financial charges and management charges, stock buybacks. They're built into the cost of providing these basic needs. So financialization sharply increases the cost of the economy, and it increases the cost of the economy in the form of rents and interest and financial charges paid to the basically the finance, insurance, and real estate sector, the fire sector, in a way that ends up shrinking the economy and preventing its ability to pay the debts. So financialization, in one sense, leads automatically to crises because its business plan is to get all the money for itself and impoverish the economy. But by impoverishing the economy, it does what Rome's did. It leads to austerity and a dark age. You can see this in education, for instance. That's been financialized in the United States. It's provided freely from Germany to China. But in America, in order to get a college education or even for many high schools, you have to borrow a loan, and the process of buying an education is like buying a loan. The prices, however much a bank is going to lend the student or the homeowner in order to get this asset, the college degree. And the problem is that all of this leads to debt deflation. In other words, you pay more, and the financialization siphons off more and more of the economy's income in the form of interest, financial fees, penalties, and economic rents to the sectors that the financial, the banking sector supports.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Michael. So let's get into our perception of value and prosperity, and start with classical economists. So can you start with give us your background and connection to the classical economics, and then tell us, what was economy for them and their view of value and how to prosper as a country. Also lots of questions, so please get back if yeah.
Well, when I was teaching in the 1960s and 70s, the history of economic thought was still part of the economics curriculum. Students had to get the history of economic thought as a core course, and they also had to study economic history. So I taught history of economic thought, and most of my early books were on the history of economic thought, especially international trade theory, balance of payments theory, American protectionism. And so I had to read all of the classical economists leading up to Marx. And the classical economics was almost diametrically opposed to the kind of economics that's taught today, which is why it's not taught in the economics courses anymore. The idea of the classical economists, from the physiocrats to Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and his followers, were to free economies from the landlord class. The classical economists wanted to develop Britain, France, Germany, other countries industrially. And they saw that the only way of becoming competitive industrially was to minimize the free lunch taken by the landlord class in the form of rent that they made in their sleep, and to get rid of monopolies, which had monopoly rent, much like land rent, and indeed to get rid of financial rents and natural resource rents also. So the idea was to free economies from having to pay rent, so that economies would only pay for people who actually contributed to the production process. And this was to be done in a number of ways. Either you would tax away land rent by a rent tax, which is what John Stuart Mill urged, or by simply nationalizing the land. There was a debate over whether the state should take control of the land by buying out the landlords, by giving them something or other, or just plain nationalizing it. But one way or other, the idea was to get rid of the landlord class. And this required, how are you going to do this in governments that are parliaments, like in Europe, that are dominated by the upper house, by the House of Lords in Britain and by the upper houses in continental Europe? Well, you had to have democratic reform. And the theory was that democratic reform, people would vote in their own interest, and they would vote to shift the tax burden onto the rentier class, the landlords, the monopolists, the wealthy people, not on labor and industry. And that was supposed to make the economies much more competitive industrially. That was the common denominator from the physiocrats all through Adam Smith and classical economics, to free economies from the burden of unearned income and the class that collected rent in their sleep.
Okay, so it seems like they wanted to get rid of the overhead and focus on that the value was made by those who created something substantial that we could use in society. Okay. Okay, so that's actually opposite to the financial sector, which extracts money from the economy.
And the
Okay, so
financial sector is in a symbiosis with the landlord class because 80% of bank loans, as we discussed last time, are mortgage loans. The
yeah,
financial sector's clientele are the rentier class, the very class that the classical economists wanted to free economies from.
okay. So when we look at the economy today, it seems like it's very, very narrowed down to individual agents and how to optimize or maximize, their profits or value, or whatever you would call it. But in a society, you actually have relations with others also. So is there a difference between how the classical economists view society and how the neoclassical views it?
Sure, they're diametric opposites. Neoliberalism is really is not individualism so much because it ends up destroying individual choice. It's an anti-government policy. What they call individualism is let's get rid of all government controls. We don't want government to have the power to tax the rentiers. We don't want government to have the power to regulate the banks. Let the banks decide what to make money on. Let the banks decide who's going to be on the Federal Reserve Board and the European central banks and in government. So it's not individualism, it's dictatorialism. It used to be called fascism a century ago. It's a centralized economy to create an oligarchy and deny 99% of the population a voice in policy making at all. That's called individualism, and it's not. It's fascism, basically. The idea is to prevent government from doing anything that does not favor the fire sector and the monopolies that it creates. So they've rewritten basically all of the laws to say, well, there's no such thing as unearned income. The basis of neoclassical and I call it neoliberal economics is to say that all income is earned, and anybody who earns any income at all, whether it's by charging interest, whether it's by being a landlord, whether it's by inheriting stocks and bonds in a trust fund and living off it, all this is a contribution to production. So all the wealth is earned, and the wealthy people are not the parasites that classical economics depicted them as. They're productive people, because how could the world exist without banks and landlords and parasites? The host needs the parasite, because life is all about the parasite. Even if it kills the host, the parasite is going to go on and jump to another host. So basically, you have an anti-life, anti-individual, predatory economics using a rhetoric that is designed to distract attention from everything that Adam Smith and the classical free market economists were actually talking about.
Okay, so what was free markets for Adam Smith? So what was free markets for Adam Smith then?
Adam Smith, the free market was a market free from economic rent, free from interest, and from the ability of the landlord class at his time, the rentier class and the financial class, to continue to wage wars to try to grab more land, to get more land rent, to try to create monopolies, and to try to create business plans that essentially were exploitative. Adam Smith wanted a free market from the rentiers, whereas the neoliberals want a free market, free markets from the government for the rentiers.
So it's the other way around again then.
Yes.
So how come that is allowed today then? I mean, why do everybody buy into it? Or not everybody, but most anyway, because that's the common order everywhere.
Well, they don't know there's an alternative. That's what Margaret Thatcher said. There is no alternative. And if you don't teach the history of economic thought anymore, and if you don't teach economic history in the economics curriculum, how are people to know that there is an alternative and that things don't have to be this way? The economy doesn't have to suffer from debt deflation. It doesn't have to go into debt to get an education. It doesn't have, you don't have to go bankrupt to pay your medical bills. You don't have to save up your pensions by lending money to a company that's trying to cut your wages. It doesn't. There's no real economic discussion of how economics really works. Instead, you have a kind of parallel universe of how an economy would work in a completely different world, different from the real world, in which government didn't exist, in which somehow the bankers were very nice and ran everything to help everything grow, and the bankers and the landlords and the monopolists were the most productive organizers of society, trying to protect it from labor and industry trying to develop their own prosperity.
Okay, thanks. That takes me actually to, so if you look into the state's role then, so what was the state's role according to the classical economists?
The state's role for classical economics is to regulate the economy, to prevent landlords from monopolizing wealth by taxing economic rent or by nationalizing the land. The state's role would be to make anti-monopoly legislation, such as you're seeing in Europe today against Google and other technology companies, to promote environmental regulations, that if a company, an oil company, pollutes, either you prevent it from polluting the environment or you fine it to prevent it. The role of government is to protect the economy from the rentiers, not serve the rentiers.
Okay, thanks. And then we take the other way around then. By neoclassical economists, what do they say is the role of the government?
To disappear and to relinquish everything and to turn all of its power over to the banks and the rich people and the 1%. And the only role of the government is to do what it did in Rome, which was to assassinate any popular leader who was for taxing or canceling the debts or advocating the redistribution of land. The role of the state for neoliberals is to protect the oligarchy from the people and to prevent democracy and to roll back everything that the 19th century was fighting for, creating a parliamentary democracy in order to free economies from the rentiers. Roll it back, and essentially they want neo-feudalism. So we don't have to call it fascism. We can call it neo-feudalism. We want to put things the way they were back in the 12th century.
Wow. Okay, it seems it seems like it's got a bit of a backward, to say the least. So what should the role of economy be then, according to classical economics?
Well, not only according to, I mean, what should it really be in reality? You mean?
Yeah.
It should prevent rent seeking. The whole idea of an efficient economy is you don't want unearned income because somebody has to pay this unearned income. If you have landlords charging whatever they want, if you have banks inflating the price of property so that people have to pay in America up to 43% of their income for a government guaranteed mortgage, then you're going to be priced out of the market. So a good economy would prevent rent seeking. It would either tax away the economic rent, which otherwise would be pledged to the bank, and it would regulate monopolies. And most important, money and credit should be public utilities. That's the problem. They shouldn't be privatized. If the problem today is that the rentier sector, the landlord class, the monopolists, the oil and gas industries, the natural resource rent recipients, if the problem of all these is that they're backed by the banks, and it's the banks and the financial sector that create trusts, is the mother of monopoly, then if you keep money and credit in the public domain, then credit will be extended for purposes that actually help promote prosperity, not that counteract prosperity. Government money creation by deficit spending is spent into the economy for labor, for industry, to build infrastructure, for productive purposes. Whereas if you privatize bank credit, that siphons off money from the economy. And the question is, what's going to become priority, the host or the parasite? And the government should help the host, not the parasite.
Yeah, well, it's basically a question of what builds a good society, I guess, and what is prosperity and what is value truly, back to that question.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that really is that really was the crux of classical economics, the value and price. Classical economics said that, well, the price exceeds, we pay many prices that don't way over what the value of things are. And the difference is economic rent. If it's okay for people to pay the cost of constructing a house or producing a commodity, but if you have to pay on top of this interest and all sorts of financial charges and rent extraction, that's not value. That's empty price. That's price without value, and that's what economic rent is. So that really is the key consideration for economic reform and for thinking about how economies work.
Okay, thanks a lot. So then, is there any country that today builds its economy differently or according to more the classical economics view?
Well, the closest to it is China, which is following pretty much the same industrial logic that Britain and Germany and the United States followed in the 19th century. It's protecting its industry. It is trying to prevent a financial oligarchy from emerging and gaining power. So it's doing what everybody thought industrial capitalism was evolving to before World War I. China's really what the kind of society that people expected Europe and the United States to evolve into before it was all sidetracked by financialization. So China has kept banking in the public domain through the Bank of China, and it can decide what to create credit for. And it's creating credit largely to build more factories, to build infrastructure for the Belt and Road Initiative, to minimize military spending as much as possible, and simply to add economic efficiency, to provide education freely, provide health care, and not to turn labor into commodities, not to make healthcare a commodity, but as a public right, not to make money a commodity, but as essentially a public utility.
Okay, interesting. So have you been working in China? In what way?
Well, I'm a professor at a number of Chinese universities. I was a professor at Peking University, and right now in Hong Kong. And I talk with government officials about how they can avoid financialization. One of the things I'm urging, one of the problems that China has right now is the same problem that you have in the United States and in Europe. What do you do with localities that are running unable to balance the budget? And my recommendation to China is what I would recommend to Europe and America. You have federal revenue sharing. Right now in China, localities in the rural areas are having to balance their budgets by selling off or leasing property to real estate developers. And that's the only way they can get money. Much as Chicago and other US cities are selling rights to parking meters or toll roads for that. And I'm urging the central bank to create the money revenue sharing so that local governments do not have to sell off the land, or if the land is sold off, to try to tax back the rising economic rental value of this land, so that you don't have a rentier class developing. And the second thing, of course, is what we're talking about. Right now, China sends many of its students to the United States to study economics here. And it made this decision around the 1980s, thinking that, well, we see that America is the most prosperous country in the world. It's running the world. How are you going to learn economics? Let's send it there and find out what it's done. Well, it turns out that what they learn, the economic students in America don't learn how America got rich, because that's not taught anymore. That's classical economics. We're taught about how to go to business school and load the economy down with debt. So I'm developing an alternative agenda, an alternative syllabus of the history of economic thought, and my summary of my ideas are going to be published in next month in Chinese and American. I have a series of lectures that are right now on YouTube in English with subtitles that are sponsored by the Lingnam University faculty in Hong Kong, and that's going to be later publicly available. I think the first lecture had 148,000 viewers, so you have an idea of how much interest there is in China of seeing that there is an alternative to neoliberal thought, and if they want to find out how America got prosperous, they actually look at how America did get prosperous in the 19th century and early 20th century, not how it's not getting prosperous anymore and is destroying its prosperity. And if China were to send its students to America, the first thing they learn is that China never should have developed, that it was a big mistake for China to make its population more richer, because that's interfering with the free market. And if China would have left a free market, then you'd still have a coolie trade. You'd still have poverty. You'd still have the way the free market is the status quo. And they're taught that China never really should have developed. It was all a mistake. And they should immediately just dissolve the government and turn power over to the banks and say it was all a big mistake. Well, you can imagine what the Chinese students must be laughing about when they hear these courses, but they have to get the degree because that's what they're here for. And it's become sort of a union card. So I'm trying to revive the alternative discussion of classical economics, which of course is exactly what led into Marxism. Now, of course, China says it's a Marxist country, quite right. But I'm saying that, well, Marx was the culmination of a whole classical tradition that led naturally to culminate in Marxism. So I'm showing how the classical foundations of Marxism, you could say.
Oh, so what are the classical foundations of Marxism?
Rent theory.
Okay, we're back to that.
Value and price theory. Value, price, and rent theory.
Okay.
In a nutshell.
Okay. So what you're saying is actually that China did what they say we shouldn't do in the Western countries. They used the state's government to create money to build the country.
Yes.
Okay, and that is a bad thing. According to common education.
That's interfering with the free market. If you had a free market, only the banks would create credit, and they'd create credit for takeover loans to buy out companies and essentially for corporate rating. So the question is, what are you going to create credit and money for? That's the real issue. What is the aim of money and credit?
Yeah. What should we use our resources for? That's true. Okay. So is there anything else you think that we should learn from China, from the economy? I'm not talking about the political system because that might be a bit sensitive, but from the economical point of view.
Just you can look at the problems that China's having right now, for instance. Its property prices are going up.
Yeah.
There are a number of companies that are in trouble. You want to see, let's look at how the financial dynamics as opposed to the industrial dynamics are developing there. Watch and see what the balance is between finance and industry, and watch and see whether China is able to maintain a predominantly labor-oriented industrial strategy and resist privatization and monopoly. Well, you've already seen that they've limited Jack Ma's attempt to use the ANT system as a telephone credit by saying, no, only the government can create credit, not you. So they're already have a pretty good feel for this. And watch it how they're de-dollarizing their economy and making themselves independent of the whole US system, which is designed basically, US diplomacy, which is aimed at spreading financialization throughout the world.
Okay, could you tell us something about the Belt and Road Initiative? Because it's written quite a lot in Swedish media about it, but it's never like any deep understanding what's written, I would say.
Well, I don't want to get into detail, but I'll get into the basic principle.
Yeah.
The question is, when you're developing ports and other shipping and railroads and basic infrastructure, is what they're trying to put in place, trade and exchange. Are you going to do this for profit or not for profit? Now, a lot of neoliberals have criticized China for the Belt and Road Initiative by saying, wait a minute, you know, people invested in the Panama Canal. That was worthwhile. We all need a Panama Canal, but the first investors all lost their money. They went bankrupt. And the same thing with the Suez Canal. Very important for world growth, but they lost all the money. It was a financial disaster. Well, China's response quite simply is, look, we're not building canals and ports to make money off the ports as such. We're building these ports in order to develop the economy and make it possible trade and exchange so that the overall economy will be prosperous and that there will be a shared prosperity between from China to spreading out to the whole length of the Belt and Road to Europe, developing all the economies there. Instead of lending like the World Bank would do, which would be basically lending for plantation agriculture and for very expensive American engineering firms. China's looking at the economy as a broad system, not here is a profit-making deal, here's a profit-making deal, here is a profit-making deal. They're looking at the economy as a mixed economy, a mixed public and private system. And how do ports and the other investments in infrastructure that China's developing actually reward the country? Well, obviously, the countries that are receiving this investment in ports have to pay something for it, but what they pay, the prosperity created by the ports and other infrastructure is what enables them to pay. So China's making productive loans to these countries, and if the country's not able to pay, it doesn't then foreclose on their property and say, aha, you have to sell off your oil wells to American firms. You have to sell off your mineral rights to American mining companies. You have to, privatize. China simply writes down the debts or defers payment. It doesn't try to make loans to countries to foreclose, and it doesn't tell countries, well, wait a minute, since it will lend you the money to pay the debt, but you have to destroy your labor unions, you have to agree to assassinate all of your land reformers, you have to agree to kill your labor leaders, you have to agree not to teach any economics but the neoliberal economics. That's what the USAID, the IMF, and the World Bank say. And China is not trying to finance the impoverishment of countries, which is the business plan of the IMF, the World Bank, and the USAID. The business, they all serve the financial sector. The financial business plan is to impoverish the economy so that the 1%, the financial class, ends up with all the wealth and all the money, leaving everybody else to shrink. that's the opposite of what China is trying to do.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Michael. Then I have actually a final question before we take some Q&A. How does QE fit into the financialization of the economy or society?
Well, its aim is to support asset price inflation. It began in 2008, 2009, after the junk mortgage and the American bank fraud crisis of junk mortgages and just the most massive bank fraud in modern history. The idea was that the banks had lent mortgage money so much in advance of the actual value of property, with debt service so far above the actual rental yield of the real estate, that the real estate prices were going to collapse. And if that would have happened, then the banks would have gone bankrupt because it's the bank claims, the bank reserves and collateral were what used to be called fictitious capital. In other words, it was a bank claim on the balance sheet. It said the banks are worth X amount of money, but the real value of the collateral backing its loans was much less. Frederick Soddy called this virtual wealth. It wasn't real wealth in the form of real tangible real estate and means of production. It was virtual wealth, claims on this real wealth way in advance. So the purpose of quantitative easing was to come in, flood the market with lower interest rates by so much that people could afford to borrow and speculate on credit. So quantitative easing was a means of subsidizing speculation in order to keep the overvaluation of property going, and essentially to turn the economy into a Ponzi scheme. For central banks, the role is to serve the interest of the banking sector. That's why there are central banks as opposed to the national treasury. And you load the economy with enough credit to borrow its way out of debt. That was the word that was the phrase that was used. Well, we're in the Ponzi phase of the business cycle, to use Hyman Minsky's phrase. In a Ponzi scheme, there's really nothing there, but prices have been going up and people think, well, there must be something there. The only way to repay the early entrants into a Ponzi scheme is to have new investors. Well, in this case, you have new bank credit coming in, and the new bank credit is coming in today. In the last few years, the Federal Reserve has been buying not only stocks and bonds, but junk bonds. There are companies that Sheila Bair is the head of the FDIC. I think we talked about this last lecture. She said, look, these are zombie companies. These are bankrupt companies, and the Federal Reserve is buying their junk bonds so that the investors in the junk bonds won't lose money. This is crazy. So the role of the quantitative easing is to keep the illusion going, that if the stock and bond markets are booming, then somehow the economy is succeeding and everything is going okay. So the business plan of the financial sector that's behind this quantitative easing is, well, you need asset price inflation, even while it's causing debt deflation for the economy at large. You have to privatize public utilities, and essentially, to do all this, you have to shift control of the government into the hands of the banks that can use the Treasury not to run a deficit to spend into the economy. Well, right now, as you know, with COVID, the American and the European economies are absolutely strapped. This is a case where the government should be creating credit to pay into the economy, to prevent individuals and small businesses and large businesses from going insolvent when their employees can't work because of the virus. But instead of creating credit to spend into the economy, instead of saying, okay, there's unemployment, we're going to build up infrastructure, the central quantitative easing is only used to finance, to buy stocks and bonds and real estate already in place, not to help the economy, not to create new means of production, not to create infrastructure. So it's enormously one-sided. And to do that, you have to essentially take over the government and make sure that democracies don't have a choice in making policy in the interests of labor or industry.
Yeah. So it seems like that is also one way of feeding the financial industry, to secure prices in the market rather than secure jobs and cash flow in businesses and for people.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay.
The whole idea that debt is, you talked before about Rome. What Rome did was bequeath a body of law that we're still in that makes all of this possible. The principle of Roman law is the opposite, to get back to what you said at the beginning of the discussion, of Near Eastern law. Debt is sacrosanct. Rome bequeathed its pro-creditor legal philosophy to Western civilization. So what's called the security of property rights is actually insecurity of these rights, because it's the priority of creditor privileges to foreclose on the homes and assets of debtors. It's basically the rule. What the U.S. calls the rule of law is a creditor-based law. It's the rule of law is written by lawyers for the banks and the corporate sector, not written by democracies at large. So whenever there's an attempt to regulate finance, to prevent monopolies, to prevent global warming, that's called interfering with financial property rights. As if somehow that's a bad thing, when the whole purpose of government is to interfere with financial property rights whose effect is to impoverish the economy.
Yeah. Yeah, to limit might be to protect. It depends on where you stand on the line, right?
Well,
hello, Michael. Hello, everybody.
So okay, thanks a lot for that, Michael.
It sounds very much an American perspective, which is fair enough. But listening to your analysis, much of which I can agree with and some of which I find strange. But what are you saying we should do to change? What changes are you suggesting that we make? That's my question, really. Thank you.
I think that's what I was talking about. The change is to follow, to free economies from the rentier class, to treat money and credit as a public utility to be used to promote prosperity, not to cannibalize economies.
No, I understand that in principle, but how do you suggest that we go about doing that?
Oh, each country is different. I don't see how it can be done in the United States without breaking up the Democratic Party. You have a duopoly here of the two parties that are essentially the same party. And most Americans want, as I said, socialized medicine and free education, and they're not getting it. Most Americans want to tax the wealthy people. We're not getting it. So you have to somehow recapture government, just like you did in the 19th century. Well, the whole 19th century leading to World War I was an attempt to democratize economies, to reform them in order to get rid of the financial sector. And it failed. We didn't end up with the classical economic ideal. We ended up with what we have today. Essentially, especially after Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan in the 1980s and the whole neoliberalism. So obviously you have to change government in order to write new sets of tax laws and environmental laws and others.
Michael, do you think that we should take money creation out of the hands of the banks and put it into the public domain?
Yeah, of course. That's why I supported the Chicago Plan, among other things, in the United States for many years with, I think, Steve Zarlenga's group that you've discussed before. Yes, that of course money creation should be in the hands of government, not banks, because governments create money for different purposes than banks do. Governments don't create money to take over existing assets and squeeze more money out of them. They spend money into the economy to create prosperity, to create assets, to create infrastructure, to create industry. Of course, it should be in the hands of government. That's the single most important change. And
is that like the central? Is that like the central bank would be the sole creator or something like that?
No, central banks are there to serve the commercial banks.
Well, I'm sure they could be made to serve whoever we like, but who would create the money? And if I'm a small business and I want 50,000 euros of a loan, would I then go in some way to the public lenders with my application? So the government would take over the entirety of creating new money to make small loans to everybody around the country.
Here's how it would be done, and here's what the Chicago plan would do. The 100% reserves. Of course, you would do just what you do now. You'd go to the bank and you'd try to get a loan. Now, the problem is the bank, in order to make the loan to you, if it doesn't already have the deposits there, it's going to need money in order to create the credit for you. If you're borrowing for a productive purpose, not to take over a company, but for a legal purpose, the government will simply create the reserves for the bank to lend you the money. The government will be creating money, but it will only create money for banks to make particular kinds of loans. So if you want the bank, if you want to borrow to buy a house, government will provide the money for it. If you want to start a business that the bank finds creditworthy, the banks will still be able to judge your creditworthiness, who gets it, but they cannot create credit out of thin air. They can't create it on.
Okay, Okay, thanks, Michael. Is there? I'm not familiar with the Chicago plan, but where could I read a 20 or 40 page description of this?
Well, I was the advisor for Dennis Kucinich, the presidential candidate here, and he had promoted the Chicago plan. So if you put in Chicago plan and then
okay, I looked that up.
NICH, and I know that Steve Zarlenga at put in with a Z has a lot of meetings where Steve Keen and I and others were speaking.
Okay, thanks very much. I've taken up a lot of everybody's time, so I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate your analysis, Michael. And my question is this. The Chicago plan has evolved into, of course, the Kucinich bill in the United States, the NEAT Act, which does set up essentially the government as a creator of money and makes banks essentially, well, I guess banks can lend like other non-financial, like other non-banks do, that is, with pre-existing money. One of the questions that has come up, and you're undoubtedly aware of this question that was raised by the authors of the book, The End of Banking, was that, well, if you just essentially impose the regulation of the NEAT Act that Kucinich generated, that limits essentially what banks can do, it won't stop the essentially creation of banks, creation of money in the shadow banking industry, and you've got to do something more than that. So my question to you is, what would happen if, in fact, in terms of shadow banking as we know it, as a result of simply ending bank creation of money and shifting money creation to the government?
That's
Thanks.
what I'm advocating. That's what the 100% reserves mean. That's exactly right. I mean, there will still be rich people with money to lend, but with financial reform, you need tax reform to go with it. You have to tax away the existing economic rent, and none of this will work unless you wipe out the overburden of debt that already exists. You cannot restabilize the economy. You cannot get out of today's depression without writing down the debts, canceling them. So that's going to end a lot of the assets that the shadow banking industry has. You will also, with a proper tax policy and with a debt cancellation, you'll create an environment where government money creation will work. In other
Okay.
words, what if China let many billionaires all of a sudden begin buying out companies and creating monopolies? Wouldn't happen there. And it didn't used to happen in the United States under the anti-monopoly laws here. So you need, you can't reform just one part of the economy, like finance together. Economic reform, and economy is a system. So you need systemic reform. Monetary and financial reform have to go together with fiscal reform, policy reform, and legal reform.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot. Hope you're happy with that. Next person is, I think it was Alec Scherer.
We live in Switzerland, and I'm here with my father. And my question is, Michael, you said that democracies don't really decide which policies and laws are enacted. In Switzerland, we have the right to make referendums on laws that we do not like, and we can vote on them as a people, and we can do initiatives to propose a change to the constitution that will be also voted on by the people. So do you think that it has an influence on how much the economy is beneficial to the people? And if yes, or do you also think that it would be a good change for societies and democracies in general if such rights were in most of the countries?
Well, a referendum is democratic. I don't think that the United States or most of Europe are democracies. They're oligarchies. But a referendum is certainly a democratic policy within an overall oligarchic structure. So if you can get a referendum and have the government actually do something, that would be fine. In the United States, if you had a referendum wanting a decent, productive policy, the problem is it would go to the Supreme Court. That is an ultra-right-wing group in the Supreme Court would say, well, I'm sorry, you're interfering with free markets. So we're just nullifying the referendum. It's against the Constitution as we unelected members of the Supreme Court interpret it. So we have problems in America that you don't have in Switzerland.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Thanks, Michael. Let's go to Don. I think I've seen you before, but you're up again, Don. Don Wilford.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. So, hi, Michael. It's a pleasure to meet you and listen to you. My question is a bit philosophical, but as a student of ancient history, I imagine Egyptian slaves and Roman soldiers and medieval peasants imagining a world with less work, more leisure, more joy, freeing the human spirit. And yet here we are today still talking about more work. We all seem to want to work more. And of course, value comes from work, and value is what's captured by owners who exploit their ownership to, if you like, enslave other people. So do you think we'll ever be able to imagine a different world, one in which there's less work and
Sure.
more of what the human experience is supposed to be about?
I wrote a book, Financialization and its Discontents, about this. Suppose that you were back in 1945 and you were told about all of the productivity gains that have been made in the last 75 years. You'd think that, oh, gee, we can have a 4-day week. We can have a 3-day week. There's so much productivity that we don't have to work. And yet somehow the more productivity goes up, the more people are working overtime. That's what's making productivity going up. You're squeezing more and more out of labor and paying it less and less. So obviously, the fact that people have to work so much harder now than they used to when I went into the workforce, it isn't a product of nature. It doesn't have to be this way. It's the product of policy. And they're working basically to pay off the debts that they're running up. So all this extra work they're doing is really just to carry the financial sector and the fire sector and the rest of the rentier sector on their shoulders. And if you get rid of the rentier sector, you won't have to work so hard.
Thanks for the question, Don, and great answer, Michael. So jump over to Stamatis. I think you're next on queue.
Yes.
Welcome.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you very much, Michael, for your talk. I'm very interested every time you make such a talk. My question is this: I was thinking that if we really had a Chicago plan based economy where reserves were in place, and there should be some way, which is not exactly clear in the Chicago plan, of how to increase the money supply. So this is usually by deficit spending of the government. But this doesn't say that this deficit wouldn't go to the fire sector. This doesn't say that financialization would be over. So the only two things that would be different in my understanding is that we wouldn't have any account of how much of this money goes there. And that would be only in government's books we had. And I don't know, is there any other difference? How would we beat financialization? It wouldn't be by changing the banking system, in fact. It would require other kinds of laws.
Yes, you're right. That's why I said the economy is a system. There have to be other changes. Of course, there would still be the government. And if the government wanted to keep spending on the military-industrial complex, or to go to war, or to subsidize corrupt privatizers and financiers, then you'd have to change the government. But you're right. The stopping the banks from creating credit solves the problem of bank credit. It doesn't solve the rest of the problems that you just brought up. There has to be an overall political reform. That's why it was called socialism in the 19th century. And I guess we could still call it socialism today. You'd need a socialist reform and a thoroughgoing political reform to restructure what's government all about. So it's not only what is money and the financial sector all about, it's what's the role of government? And is it to help society? Is it to help the 99% or to help the 1%? Is it to help clean up the world environment? Is it to promote peace, or is it to promote world war, like is the role of government today in Europe and America?
Okay, so I'll add one more question, a follow-up one. So in our case, in the EU, we have, in my understanding, a problem with the situation because the thing is out of the hands of government. It's inside treaties. It is inside treaties. It's in the Lisbon Treaty.
Basically, your governments are a branch of NATO, to make it long.
Yes, well, that's one step further than I wanted to take it. In the international set, yes, that's the situation, because the banking system is eventually dependent on New York banks, and that's why we depend on NATO then.
No, you depend on NATO.
It's the other way around.
So you have corrupt politicians, right-wing politicians, financed by corrupt right-wing groups. You have a right-wing government because Europe is not very democratic.
Right, but how does this make us dependent on NATO?
That's who essentially pays the checks to buy your politicians, especially in Brussels. My friend Paul Craig Roberts was Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, And he explained to me that the principle to get is simply you can buy politicians, and European politicians are about the cheapest in the world because they're just so greedy.
I won't disagree there. Okay, thank you, Michael.
Okay. Thanks, Stamatis. Then we go to Jeremy. So if you unmute yourself, I hope I pronounced that right.
There we go. Thank you, Josie. Hi, Michael. Would you walk us through a little bit about debt deflation? It's something you've mentioned before. Now, debt deflation, as I understand it, as one amateur, results from is a consequence of the repayment of principal, interest, and fees to banks, which accept them by reducing the liability side, which happens to be our money supply. That's my understanding of debt deflation, but I'd be interested in hearing yours. And in addition, what happens when government deficit spending for, let's say, the most worthy of causes that we might all agree with, not for oligarchic causes, what happens when that collides with debt deflation? Doesn't that still create an enormous disparity between the bank reserves that banks get, which accrue interest, and the deposits that mere depositors get, which disappeared via the repayment of principal?
No, there's no conflict at all. Now we're getting to the area of modern monetary theory. Stephanie Kelton has just published a good book explaining all of this. And the whole, the University of Missouri at Kansas City, where I used to be on the faculty, spent years and years explaining all this. What you're suggesting was called the crowding out theory. You think if the government spends money, there's less to be spent in the domestic economy. The government can create as much money as it wants. It has no connection at all with crowding out money elsewhere in the economy.
I don't believe I was elucidating the crowding out theory. But deficit spending does increase bank reserves or banks' holdings of treasuries. They augment bank assets. Bank liabilities is even if the liabilities, even if it's spent for, let's say, some flood worker, some fire worker, that individual is simply getting a bank IOU, a deposit, and as they repay principal, interest, and fee back to the bank, is that not debt deflation, resulting in a disparity between what banks are able to earn as in
what you described is not how the world works at all. That's a crazy theory. The government doesn't have to borrow from the banks. Again, Stephanie Kelton has explained all of this. The government can create money. It doesn't need to borrow from the banks. It doesn't need to pay interest on bonds if it creates the money. It can just print the money. There's no connection at all. You're suggesting a right-wing Austrian theory that's been thoroughly discredited. I know you're not doing it on purpose, but that's not how the world works. And you'll have to read about modern monetary theory or look at the Federal Reserve Bulletin and look at the balance sheet and just trace the flow of credit yourself. And if you look at the statistics, you'll find out that what you've described is just a fantasy.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. We have Reitze Kaiser. I hope that was like kind of proper pronunciation. You're unmuted, but we can't hear you. No, you're not unmuted.
Okay.
Now you are. Thank you.
Here. Hello, everyone here from The Hague, the Netherlands. You did pronunciate my name correctly, Reitze Keizer. I'm very, very happy with this lecture of Michael. Thank you very much, Michael, for especially the fresh economic perspective you are giving. I'm thinking fighting the fire sector is difficult. Influencing the democratic discussion is also difficult. What we need is a sustainable development goal number 18. I tell it my students there's missing SDG 18 about monetary, financial, and tax reform. But it's understandable it's missing because the whole world would be against it. So another option is perhaps electronic digital money. What do you think of parallel local monies to create a new flow of money around the fire sector? Let them stay where they are, and let us focus on creating a new economy.
It doesn't work. This has been discussed for 100 years. If it would have worked, the note guild in Germany in the Weimar period would have worked out. It has to be at the federal level because basically, what is it that gives money its value? And what that is the ability to use money to pay taxes. And the only way that localities could create money is to make it acceptable in paying enormous amount of taxes. And most localities just would not be able to do that because one locality would be played off against another, and it would end up not being successful. So in practice, the local currency, much as people would like to think of it as working, it doesn't work out in practice. It's a long story, but there's a huge literature about that.
Okay, it's a pity because fighting the fire sector is very, very difficult, and I don't see any perspective that will change in the near future. So yeah,
we need a revolution.
No,
yeah,
local money creation is a revolution.
I don't like revolutions. I was also very impressed about your story about the Jubilee in ancient history, because at home, my father, reading in the Bible, he told us from Leviticus 25 that thou shalt not economically oppress one another. My father was an economist, and so he taught us about economics. Do not oppress one another, and that's the kernel of a good economy. And yeah, the fire sector will not join us in that.
Well, you don't have to go back to the Bible or biblical times. You can look in 1948 at the German economic miracle. That was the debt cancellation.
You're right. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I can. Sure. If I can say something, guys, that is that what we try to do.
What?
Can you hear me now?
Now I can.
Yeah, sorry, something happened with my mic. I thought you was just ignoring me. Thank you very much, guys. But no, what I was going to say is that what we're trying to do here in Sweden with Positiva Pengar is actually have a grassroots movement, because we think it has to come from there if we want to get the difference in this. Because legally we have a democracy, which means we are voting, but we need to be aware of what we are voting about, okay? And we need to exercise that vote, and we need to exercise that right, and we need to get away from corrupt thinking and corrupt policies and whatever it's corrupt in order to get something done. So actually we do believe it's possible to change this, and I do believe it can go quite quickly when it starts to spread properly. And I that's our conviction anyway. So I think grassroots movement, make that go, and make it go quickly and forcefully but kindly, okay? With power but kindly. And I think sorry?
Especially if you're armed.
Yeah, well, we are armed with knowledge, and we need to trust on our ability to make it happen. Yeah, that's my view on it. Sorry for the interruption, but anyway. So I think next up is actually Cecil Exam. You've been waiting a bit. Elikam, sorry. Sorry, Cecil.
No.
Yeah,
okay,
welcome.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm a first-year economics student, so forgive me if I sound infantile or if I sound amateur.
You're not
Um,
as infantile as you will be when you get a PhD in economics.
Sure. You talked about debt cancellation, and I was wondering, can that be the breakout for African economies? You talked about debt cancellation, and I was wondering if that could be a breakout for African economies.
I think there's an interruption in the sound.
Okay.
Can you tell me what he said?
Yeah, the question was if debt cancellation could be used in African economies.
Can you still hear me? Yeah, you talked about debt cancellation, and I was wondering if that could be a breakout for African economies.
You were wondering what? If it's possible or what?
You talked about debt cancellation. Can you hear me?
Yeah, of course. You have to write down the existing debts. And of course, nobody's really talking about that. And that's what makes my analysis different from most other people. Right now, the debts cannot be paid. And the question is, how are they not going to be paid? The only way to pay them at present is the way they were paid after 2008, by a mass foreclosure on the property of debtors. And when third world countries can't pay their debts, the southern countries, then they have to sell off and privatize their public domain. The other way of not paying debts is resolving it is just to cancel the debts. I think there has to be a third world debt write-off, a cancellation of student debts. You have to really do what Germany did in 1948. You cancel the debts, and the good thing about canceling the debts is you wipe out the savings on the other side of the balance sheet. By wiping out the debts of the 99%, you wipe out the savings of the 1% and take away the sledgehammer that the 1% uses to keep the rest of the economy in debt peonage. And it's necessary to realize that that's the existential choice that today's economy has. And it's either you'll have a debt cancellation or you'll have barbarism. And basically that's what my the book that I'm publishing in next month, my Chinese lectures, are all about.
No, we can't hear you again. Okay, sorry. Thanks for jumping in. Hope you were happy with that answer. Do you have time for a few more questions, or? Okay.
My eyes were blurry from looking at the screen, so I'm closing my eyes. But yes, I can
Okay.
talk now that I've turned off the screen.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I think Joe Polito has been in the queue for some time. Can you unmute yourself?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Thanks.
Fantastic presentation, Michael, as always. I hope this question is on topic. Here in Canada, one of our major banks just published a report on affordable housing. And one of their suggestions was that we increase the amount of capital gains that are included in taxation on commercial real estate deals. And I know you've written about this, and I wondered if you could explain the logic of this measure and its impact on the land prices and affordability for housing. Thank you very much.
Well, capital gains are what landlords and speculators make in their sleep. They're a result of banks creating more and more credit to bid up prices of property. And capital gains are what you make by the banks loading the economy down with real estate debt. So, and because they're unearned, the entire capital gain should be taken away, or at least 90% of it. And in fact, when the first income tax was there, these would have been taxed away. The financial sector led the political campaign in the United States not to tax capital gains. And in Europe, England and Europe, many capital gains are not taxed at all. And that's a travesty. Most financial fortunes are made not by earning interest, not by earning profits, but by capital gains. I've published a number of articles that are on my website showing the charts. And here's how much in profit, here's how much in capital gains. So the fortunes of the 1% are not made by earning money or investing or making profits or saving up their income. It's capital gains. They have to be taxed away above everything else. And that was exactly what John Stuart Mill was writing about in 1848 in his Principles of Political Economy, with some of their applications to social philosophy. Yeah, basically, he said the reason that the government should be the owner of land is so that you will not have landlords making money in their sleep by what we call capital gains now, by the rising rental value of their property that's increasing it. And he didn't even imagine that the property prices would be inflated by bank credit like they are today. So of course, that's a very good suggestion. And if you tax away the capital gains, not only will you save yourself from the 1%, but you won't have to tax Canadian labor and Canadian industry, if there is any, so much.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So, oh no, I took away someone. Who was that? Sorry. Gunnar, you're up next. Gunnar Brundin.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it took some time. Hello, Michael. I want to add to Don Wilford's question about how much should we work. If the central bank, or if the government and the central bank gave out money for universal basic income, what would you say about that? The question is the informal sector productive, as you see it? As I see it, in Sweden, we consume, we have a consumption as big as if we had 4.2 planets to get our resources from. And I also see that the informal sector needs labor, not paid labor, but labor. What will, if a part of the newly created money was to go to basic income, what would you say?
I think everybody deserves enough money to live. Of course, basic income is a very good idea. My colleague Pavlina Chernova from the Levy Institute has written quite a bit about this. The counter argument is, well, if you give everybody a basic income, they won't go to work. Who's going to be working at McDonald's and these things? Well, the solution's simple. Pay them a decent wage. Once you pay a decent wage, that'll solve the problem immediately. But if you're not going to pay them a basic wage, then of course they're not going to work for an income that does not enable them to live. So everybody has a right to live, and the government should support them, but it should also support a basic minimum wage, unlike what you have in the United States, where President Biden has said the one thing he's going to fight against is to prevent a minimum wage. The minimum wage in America only enables you to, forces you to go on public welfare. So the people work for Walmart or other big stores here, they get a wage supplement. So the government is actually paying the wages that Walmart doesn't have to do. That's a travesty. That's the Democratic Party's policy. That's the policy, the Democratic Party's policy is to squeeze down labor. So it's absolutely driven into the market and pauperized. That's why any rate, the solution is to raise the basic wage, which no party in the United States is willing to do. They fought against it like anything, and that's why they've the elections here are so fraudulent in preventing people like Bernie Sanders or other left-wingers from getting elected who want to pay a decent living wage.
But must it be a wage? Why couldn't everyone have a minimum basic income that you can live on?
That's what I meant, basic income.
Yes, it's because then you can choose your employer.
Yes.
And that's important, and what you want to do. And maybe you are needed at home or in your local community also.
Yes.
So it's something that makes every person decide her own future and decide what to do with their lives.
Yes, otherwise you'll pauperize the economy, as you're having throughout, let's say, the Soviet, ex-Soviet countries in Central Asia today, or the Baltics. You're forcing a mass immigration from countries that don't have a basic wage. They have to emigrate in order to find work, in order to live. Baltics, Central Asia, Greece, Latin America.
But I mean, at the same time, you can finance the public sector, of course, because people won't go and lie on their bed, on their sofa, everyone. That is not for most people.
Right. No, there are many ways of administering around that. Nobody, obviously, people want to work, want to be productive in one way or another.
Yes.
But the fact is, you want to avoid pauperization.
The question is actually how to secure the pension, and I think that is another systemic thing needed to look into.
Pensions should be, as we've just been discussing, with a basic income. Pensions should be pay as you go, the way Germany does, by the government. You don't have to financialize pensions. That's what is one of the big problems of financialization, as we discussed earlier in this interview. Financializing pensions is a way of helping the financial sector deindustrialize the economy.
Yeah, so and basically the pension is dependent on the productive capacity of the country you're living in, because you're living on the real economy. So,
yes.
But I think the question is a bit bigger than we can take right now, if you don't mind, both Elizabeth and Michael, and we jump forward.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Michael, for a really good talk. I want to return to the theme you mentioned before about this current Ponzi scheme that we're living in. With the ever more quantitative easing and these unprecedented zero interest period that we've been in. Do you see any natural end to that? Could that go on forever? Do they just double the quantitative easing every 5 years? Or when will we reach a breaking point in that development, do you think?
There's no way of knowing when the breaking point would come. And I'm discussing with Wall Street people all the time. We're watching the economy go down. We're watching the stock market go up. It's what you call a K-shaped recovery. Down for the economy, up for the financial sector. How can they, on earth, can they go up? Well, the answer is the Federal Reserve can just do the quantitative easing on and on. Of course, it can't last forever, but there's no way of knowing when the break will come. And if you look over the last few hundred years, the break usually comes because some big bank has a fraud somewhere. You have a rogue trader making trades for himself with the bank's money that lose, like the London Whale. You have at AIG, the insurance company, the London office made a lot of bad underwrites for derivatives trade. Will somebody make a bad bet in derivatives trade and go under? And will that pull down the whole sector? Nobody knows where the break in the chain of payments will occur or when it will come. But as the economy gets more overstretched and more debt leveraged, the economies, how can the economy recover and produce profits to support rising stock prices when we're in the middle of debt deflation, where it's a contradiction. There's no way that you can have the finance sector going up and the economy going down unless you end up with feudalism, which is what happened when this occurred in Rome 2,000 years ago. So obviously, this cannot, at some point, we're going to end up with a huge crash, but nobody knows when it will be coming or what will trigger it. Usually it'll be some accident that triggers it. People would have thought that the COVID would trigger it. And maybe it will, because in America, there's been a moratorium on rent payments and mortgage interest payments, and the moratoriums are about to expire. When that expires, there are going to be massive evictions, homeless people thrown onto the streets. Will they sleep on the subways and the parks? Will they fight back? Who knows what will happen? We're moving into an anarchic period right now, and but nobody can see exactly what's going to happen in chaos.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. What I would like to say then is that, Michael, thank you very, very much for you sharing of your very vast experience, and actually from practical experience to being in many, many places and reading and, whatever all the things you've done, and that you take your time to share it with us here. I really, really appreciate it. And we got to learn quite a lot this time. So I can say from everybody here and from our association, thanks a lot, and thanks for everybody who contributed and what do you say, turned up to this webinar. We're gonna do, Michael, a transcript as usual. It takes some time, as last time. Our English is like not fluent, as you might hear, so it takes a bit of time. But then we send over it, and we're gonna send links to everybody who's been here too. Then, okay. So we'll be in touch. Thanks a lot, Michael. Again, I deeply appreciate all you share with us, and from everybody else, thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thanks everybody else. See you later. Bye.